Hi, everyone.
Hello. We're in John Wesley Bready, This Freedom Whence, page 45, in the chapter called Slave Trading and Bubble Finance. He has the subhead Kidnapping, Bound Labor, and Transportation. The concomitant evils of slavery, however, were perhaps even more devastating to the social and economic life of 18th century Britain than the accursed institution itself. The name of these evils is legion, and their exhaustive examination would fill a volume. Kidnapping, in its various forms, for instance, reached the proportion of a considerable business, and for decades it was winked at, if not encouraged, in high places. The East India Company got a large percentage of its sailors through the guile of the same crimps, decoys, and kidnappers as supplied crews for slave ships. In London, these nefarious agents, working in bands, seduced youths into questionable quarters, and there entrapping them, spirited them off to secret detention dens, quote, until they could be sold into the hands of Bengal ship captains, unquote. The appalling death rate, moreover, among these East India crews often exceeded that among slaver crews. But far wider flung was the kidnappers' net for white workers to sell through contractors to planters in America. Early in the Restoration period, the spiriting of young persons to sell as virtual slaves on American plantations was becoming a pestilence. In 1671, an affidavit was sworn against a certain William Teene, quote, who in 1 year spirited away 840, unquote. While 3 years earlier there were simultaneously 3 ships in the Thames on which spirited children had been embarked, and, quote, though the parents see their children in the ships without money, they will not let them have them, unquote.
But in the 18th century, with the further growth of the slave trade, came a corresponding rival in the kidnapping trade. Its victims were chiefly young persons and children of working age, and in plying its wiles it was no respecter of sex. It is clear, says Dr. Dorothy George in this connection, that all sorts of villainies were practiced. For instance, the captain of a ship trading to Jamaica would visit the Clerkenwell House of Correction, ply with drink the girls imprisoned as disorderly, and invite them to go to the West Indies. Then he would have the intoxicated volunteers spirited off to be sold into 7 or 10 years of plantation labor without pay. Generally, however, the approbation was more direct. The kidnapping of Elizabeth Brickleband in 1775 is a case in point. This girl of 17 was decoyed from her mother's house to an office, and thence spirited on board the brig Nancy and sold at Baltimore. Her mother, by sheer persistence, had the office keepers, a man and wife, brought to trial, when it was revealed that the sponging house, run by these infamous characters, was a dragnet in which nearly 100 similar victims had been caught.
J.W. Judwine, in his book Religion, Commerce, Liberty, 1683 to 1793, speaks of, quote, the immense numbers exported by the kidnapping trade both on the coast of Scotland and Ireland for the indented labor of the planters, unquote. This is an aspect of 18th century social history which has been much neglected. But beyond doubt, the kidnapping trade threw out multifarious tentacles along the coast of Scotland and Ireland, whence it commanded an even more voluminous commerce than from England and Wales. Dr. George refers to, quote, the days when the kidnapping of children for the plantations was general, unquote, but being commonly regarded as the most daring branch of the gigantic smuggling business business, its movements were necessarily kept secret, thus making accurate contemporary evidence hard to come by. Certain it is that the spiriting trade was a secret auxiliary to the slave traffic, but as the Negro slave trade was legal and the kidnapping trade illegal, the latter resorted to every possible artifice to cover its tracks. And the fact that its victims belonged chiefly to the ignorant, poverty-stricken, and often rum-sodden classes who could afford no litigation makes the veil of mystery surrounding this spiriting traffic the more inscrutable. Nor was the government in this matter inclined to be inquisitive. Its own press gangs were birds of a feather. It was resorting to light devices to rid itself of many prisoners and of such felons as had escaped the gallows. And directly or indirectly, it was dependent upon the same gang of touts and crimps for the execution of its own transportation schemes. In the last analysis, too, many of the retired planters from the West and East Indies were almost as immediately implicated in the kidnapping traffic as in the slave traffic. Yet these gentlemen, as we have seen, outbidding all comers in the purchase of rotten borough seats in Parliament, had acquired substantial influence in government circles.
That's terrible. Of the bound servants sent at this time to the American plantations, chiefly Maryland and Virginia, there were three kinds. 1, indented workers. 2, redemptioners, or free willers. 3, convicts. The indented workers entered into a written contract with the master of their ship to serve for a fixed term of years, generally 4, though varying from 2 to 7, in return for their passage. Redemptioners were promised a stated length of time after landing, wherein to find masters willing to advance their passage money, and so redeem them, it being agreed that if they failed, the captain might dispose of them after the manner of indentured servants. But the truth is that they were lured to the tobacco and cotton plantations under false pretenses. Despite all assurances, it was next to impossible for them to find masters willing at once to advance redemption money, and the ship captains, knowing this, rarely let them land until conditions of semi-slavery were saddled upon them. Aye. Sin of man.
Next, Brady's going to deal with convict labor specifically. So we'll put a link in on your screen to a section of our Why Jesus tract, a discussion we did of, is Christ responsible for oppression and slavery?